So this presentation actually begins with a reference to that which is on the tombstone of my father, a passage referencing Abraham being called by God saying, I'm going to show you the land. And when you grow up, you don't necessarily think that your life's destiny is to live someplace completely different from where you were raised, but that becomes a part of our story. And because my dad and mom got married, they share in this story. But this particular story really does focus on the life of my mother and her family. And as a result of this, I've thought about how I might present this in a very compelling way. And I have a very cinematic mind. And I thought, well, maybe the story would begin as you are flying, kind of a drone shot, flying over the fields in the Netherlands, in northern Holland, in the province of Groningen. And as you're sweeping across the fields of grain, you see a church steeple in the distance, and you actually fly into the sanctuary. And there you see the congregation and a minister preaching fervently on the Lord's Day, and the camera flies out of the sanctuary, flies up the steeple over the roof. And here you see a classic, by the way, this was the church my parents were married in, Maria Kirk, built in a classic cruciform shape. And many have commented that bombers, when they would make their runs to Deutschland, would many times rely on the orientation of all these cruciform churches that faced east. And so they could always check their bearings if they weren't sure that their compasses were working correctly. And as you fly off that church, oh, by the way, you know you're at a Dutch church when you see this in your parking lot. This is how they all get to church on Sunday morning. You fly over more fields, and then you hit the largest dike at the edge of the boundary of Holland. You fly over the ocean, and you're suddenly hovering over a small island just off the coast. And you come in and you focus in very closely, and then you notice that there are German soldiers, Nazi soldiers, preparing their armaments for battle. And then you fly down the barrel of the gun, and you know something serious is about to happen. So this island is called Borkum. It's just off the, this would be the Netherlands right here, and it's kind of like an Antilles chain. And these islands over here belong to the Netherlands, and this is a big island that belongs to Deutschland. And this is where a military installation was, and where they put big cannons to shoot anything that would be on land or in sea. And I want to start the story with just kind of bringing weight to this situation and how close my parents were to this type of trouble and trial during war. Once again, here's the northern province. This is Deutschland. And my mom, her residence was in Althuizen, but that put her farm right about here. And from her house atop the barn, she could see Borkum. And it was the practice that when airplanes would attack that island, she would climb up on the roof and see the action of what was transpiring between airplanes bombing this island. And of course, she could even see the bombs fall and land, and she would say, oh, that one missed. But then when one hit and something really big blew up, the next thought was, oh my goodness, a bunch of people just died there. So she could witness this all from the top of her family barn, and we'll show you the farm in a moment. And this is kind of a real-time view. That's how close Borkum is to the Netherlands. Here is an actual photograph, and the notation underneath says these are Beaufighters. This is a British aircraft attacking a minesweeper off Borkum, right here. August 25 of 1944. So the things that she saw as a kid, these are real incidences, and This was a strategic outpost for the Nazi stronghold over that area. This leads me to the next story. This is an American flight crew stationed out of North Dakota, and they were going to fly their sortie into Deutschland. And every crew that flew out had a primary target. Sometimes something would go wrong and you couldn't reach your destination, so on your return there were secondary targets, there were tertiary targets, someplace to drop your bombs. Real quick story about bombs. One evening, the planes would fly overhead from England into Deutschland, and you could just hear the rumblings of hundreds and hundreds of bombers. One particular evening, and my son's got a theory about it, about being a giant bunker buster bomb. There's a bomb that, a plane carrying only one bomb. For some reason, one got dropped not far from the farm and blew out some 17 windows out of the house. Just the massive impact of these armaments. Anyway, so anytime that the planes were heard from then on out, it was get your clothes on. The same practice for when there were thunderstorms. Thatched roof, barn, you put your clothes on and you get ready to escape in case the house gets hit. Well, this crew ran into trouble on their way to their bombing target, and they were flying back. Borkum was an island that they said, if you can't drop your load where you're supposed to go, on your way back, hit Borkum. Well, unfortunately, their engine trouble forced them to land, and you saw that chain of islands. They should have chose another island to land on, but that's where they landed, on this particular island. And you can look this up online. It's called the Borkum War Trial. These men landed on the beach, and they were apprehended by Nazi soldiers. They should have been loaded up in trucks and carried across the island to the military installation. Instead, they frog marched the entire crew through town, where every member of the town got to take physical abuse of them and virtually beat them all to death. And those that could actually walk on their own, by the time they got to the military installation, they were immediately executed. And a war trial was enacted against those who had perpetrated that against this American flight crew. The mayor of the island, the general, whoever in charge, they were both executed as a result of this trial, and several others were put in prison, and almost all those prison sentences were commutated by the 50s. They weren't going to keep people in prison. When they were like, you're going to jail for life for what you did. Anyways, in 2003, someone posted this placard to recall those U.S. airmen who were killed under tragic circumstances. No real explanation as what those circumstances were. And sadly, the English word is wrong there. But anyway, these are last names of men you know. We have a Graham at our church. Again, the price and cost of war and the atrocities that took place there. Okay, so let's come back to Holland, and let's come back to finding out what led up to World War II. There's a context for this war. It just didn't happen. And of course, in 11/11 of 1918, everyone knows that's the Armistice Day, right? We call it Veterans Day now. World War I, the war to end all wars, concluded in 1918. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919. And immediately after that document was signed, German people, the Prussian people, were very upset at the terms of that deal, and they thought that they had been overly punished for what had transpired. And not long after that, the Great Depression sent the entire world into an economic tailspin, and priorities for governments changed. And there was a lot of political wrangling that goes on during these times of days. And it was during this sort of situation, when there was a lot of despair and a lot of people looking for answers, they found a person named Adolf Hitler who, and take it for what it's worth, he was going to make Germany great again. And people glommed onto his program, even though he was a ruthless partisan, and we all know about the brown shirts and the people that he would execute to acquire power. But if you didn't know all those back stories that were happening, and you saw this man getting industry happening again, making things happen, seems like prosperity is coming back to the land. The popularity of National Socialism spread everywhere through Europe. They just thought this was the way you have to get out of the Depression. This is the way that you restore national greatness again. So there was a huge socialist party in the Netherlands. There were communists. There were all kinds of different parties. The Christian Democrats, all over the place, all kinds of political parties. In the 1930s, Jewish immigration became propelled out of Deutschland into the Netherlands because they were just next door, because there was ongoing persecution. Of course, Kristallnacht happened in 1938. That's when people went rioting and looting and breaking storefronts, and especially Jewish people, they wanted them out of their country, and the persecution became so apparent it was the time for people to leave. Not all Jews left, we know. There's a classic way of just sort of taking your faith underground and not trying to stick out, but the Nazi program was built to root out everyone who had any connection to the Jewish faith and lineage. This was some of what was happening to set up the conditions for World War II. Now, in particular in the Netherlands, every young man after high school had to serve compulsory service for 2 years. But after World War I concluded and sort of, hey, that was the war to end all wars. Why are we making guys go 2 years in this? Let's just bring it back to 6 months. Let's just develop, character in them and a common patriotism in them. We don't need them to serve for 2 years because we're not going to go to war again now. We're not going to do that again. Of course, with the Depression going on and you've got limited funds, the Dutch Army and military, Navy, Air Force, they had all these wings of the military. They just did not spend money to upgrade. They were busy building one new warship. They only had one tank in all of this country. And they weren't building them themselves. They had to acquire them from other countries who were committed to these types of programs. So everything they had was World War I planes and guns. And there was a historic defense program for the Dutch. It served them well for all of their history. If anyone invaded, we just flood the canals, we turn this place into an island, and there's no way they can attack us. Well, I'm sorry, technology changes, and flooding your borders is not going to keep an airplane or a group of men from parachuting into your country. So all these debates went on. People were talking left and right about what they should do, but this is what they did do. Additionally, an important date happened on September 1st, 1939. That's when the Nazis invaded Poland. Immediately, the United Kingdom declared war on Nazi Germany. And immediately, the Dutch army and the reserves were mobilized. My grandfather, his name is Lammert, he was called up as a reservist, and they were going to begin preparing for war against Germany. And every male of serviceable age or who had experience, they were called up. It was a massive call up for everyone. But Germany tells the Netherlands that they have no interest in invading. And you say, well, why would you believe that? Of course, you go back to history and you find out, that during World War I, there was never really a battle that took place on Dutch soil. There's only a few Dutchmen that died as a result of World War I. The Queen, her husband, was from the German monarchy, and there was a relationship there, and when the Germans tell you, we're not going to invade you, and we've got familial connections, you think, okay, then we are going to back off. And by this time, they wanted to get in line to order armaments, tanks and guns and boats, but they were told, you're going to have to wait in line, because you know how many countries want stuff now? Now that Hitler's invaded, it's a little too late to ask for these things at this particular time. The reserves were disbanded, and the Dutch took another historical position. They said, we're going to seek neutrality in this situation. We're going to ride out this war like we did World War I. Well, on May 10th, 1940, 750 Nazi troops invaded the Netherlands. And over a period of 4 days, where actually the Dutch put up a resistance that the Germans weren't prepared for. They just thought that they would be overwhelmed by the size of the army, but they didn't. The Germans resorted to bombing a key city called Rotterdam. 2,800 people were killed, 2,800 Dutchmen were killed. At that point, it was capitulation. There's just no way you're going to be able to stop people from just free flying over your country and bombing things and killing your citizens. So after some short-lived battles and the bombing of Rotterdam, the monarchy and hundreds of ships escaped to the United Kingdom. That warship they were building, it got towed to the English Isles. There's some wonderful backstory about how all these Dutch fishermen and sailors actually contributed to the war effort for the Allies during this time. Another interesting story is that near Jackson, Mississippi, is an Air Force base where they train Dutch pilots to fly for the Dutch National Air Force. So Dutchmen were coming here to the United States to be trained to fly in World War II, and they were trained down near Jackson, Mississippi. There's a plaque there commemorating that as well. Well, some really interesting things transitioned in the Netherlands as a result of this. When the Nazis came in, they immediately took a census of the entire population. They just wanted to know who was there. And being compliant, everyone told the new rulers who was in their house, what age they were, you know, what their education was, what their job was. They were too honest, especially the Jews. In fact, one of the frustrations, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is because of the census that was taken, the Nazis knew how many Jews were in the Netherlands. And halfway through the war, they were sending special people to the Netherlands saying, where are your Jews? We know how many are here. You haven't even turned in half of them yet. And we'll talk about the reason why that transpired. Another very interesting historical note, there's a man named Arthur Sessencourt. He became the Reichskommissar. He is appointed by Germany. You don't realize that the National Socialist Party of the Netherlands was actually excited that they were going to have socialism now. There were a lot of Dutch leaders of the socialist movement there who were like, hey, we're ready to lock arms with you and let's make socialism work here. But the Nazi regime said, no, we're going to send someone outside to run this country. And that immediately made the socialists in the Netherlands upset. It's like, wait a minute, aren't we on the same team here? Why are you putting someone in charge of what we're living here? So it was a very interesting move, and it started to make the socialists, who were honestly socialists and didn't have any violence in their body, they just had a different view of world governments and affairs, they wanted to know why someone else had to run the party. And then suddenly there was this component to being socialist. You had to turn in Jews. And a ton of households suddenly were freaking out. Because, wait a minute, I didn't sign up to be a socialist to send my neighbors to concentration camps. I had a different objective. And then some people, because they wanted to continue to become more connected to the new regime, they actually swallowed their they swallowed their morality and said, yeah, okay, I'll turn in Jews. But a lot of people said, no, I'm done with this. I'm out. I'm not going to, this is something different. The famous expression was, when a Dutchman was asked if they knew any Jews, they would say, no, I only know Dutchmen. There wasn't this kind of antipathy toward the Jews in the Netherlands. Well, anyways, this Arthur Sessencourt, he actually is one of the men who is tried at Nuremberg in the famous war trials after World War II, and he's convicted and he is hung. His last words were, I believe in Deutschland. So, just a very sad individual, but he wreaked a lot of death and destruction in the Netherlands. The NSB, the Nationalistic Socialistic Knorringa, that was the only political party. All political parties were disbanded. It was a one-party system now. And if you wanted to become a police officer, or if you wanted to have any role in any public life, you had to be a party member, and you had to sign on to the party goals. So this was the government taking over everything and not allowing the types of freedoms that they were used to. And of course came the sanctions. You weren't allowed to have radios. You weren't allowed to have guns. All newspapers were shuttered. They only could be the socialist newspapers. Electricity was cut off. Everything about the government was going to control every situation that was going on. Now it's really interesting to read this list because my grandfather, Lammert, he had a radio. He had a gun, he had electricity, he found a way to get electricity. In fact, that's one of the scenes of my movie. One of his sons is walking on to the property from the fields, and he suddenly sees the electrician driving off on his motorcycle. And say, hey, what's going on here, what's up? And running to his dad and complaining and saying, why does the electrician have my motorcycle? And then having my Opa turn on the light switch. Say, that's why he has a motorcycle. We have our electricity. You had to do things very discreetly and covertly to work around these systems because they were controlling every aspect of your life. You had to carry papers with you. That famous line, show me your papers, is not a joke. People had to have a paper that told people where they were going, what they were going to do when they got there, and when they were going to go back to where they came from. Everything had to be detailed about what you were doing out in public. Of course, your name and your family and everything. The government had to know. Unless you had an Ausweis, and we'll talk a little bit about that more, but basically, you know the phrase essential worker? If you had an Ausweis, you were an essential worker. You were free from a lot of the compulsory things because you were doing something that was helping the government. Just a point of clarification as we look at my uncle's Ausweis, the required identification paper that everyone had to have in their possession. The only way you were termed an essential worker is if you had a special stamp inside that would release you from the requirements of the forced labor that we're going to be learning about in just a moment. Everything was rationed. You couldn't go to the store and get anything unless you had ration cards. Not just food, not just toilet paper, everything, shoelaces. Everything was rationed. If you wanted to get it, you had to turn in a ticket for it, and you had to earn that ticket by your obedience to the system. They could come into your house, they could search your body if you were carrying anything from the store, and I tell you, if you were carrying anything that you weren't supposed to be carrying, you were in trouble and you were sent to prison. You could not do anything that was trouble for the government. And you might have done something innocently, and if it was seen as being anti-government, you were jailed. You were supposed to report sedition. And one of the famous stories, and I've told this to our congregation after one particular historic Sunday that happened in our country, but my mom's pastor, as a part of his pastoral prayer, prayed for the Queen of Holland. And everyone knew that the Queen and the royal family had escaped to England. But the scriptures say that we're supposed to pray for kings and for people in authority. And he voiced a prayer for the Queen of Holland. And because of that, someone in the congregation snitched on him, probably got rewarded for it, said, hey, our pastor prayed for the Queen. That pastor was arrested and he was sent to a concentration camp. My mom remembers seeing him after the war. He did survive his concentration camp, but he was a pretty well-rounded individual, and she said after the war he was just skin and bones. So that's what sedition is when someone does and says something that they shouldn't be saying. And that happened repeatedly. Another sad aspect of the war was this thing called the Jewish Council. There were two very prominent Jewish people, one a professor and one who ran like the largest mining diamond company in the Netherlands, kept telling Jewish people, they would meet them at the train stations when they were being hauled off in the boxcars, saying, do what the Nazis are telling you to do. They're going to take care of you. They're going to help us. These are good things that they're doing. And I tell you, I've read so many different accounts about whether they were really being underhanded and actually trying to slow down the export of Jewish people, to people saying that they would just sold their souls to the Nazis and they should be not remembered with anything wholesome about them. It's kind of a weird back and forth as people describe the role of the Jewish Council. All right, well, the resistance took place. It's sort of funny that word shows up now in our time. The reason it shows up in our time is because people are hearkening back to this type of activity. The resistance is to fight against those who are trying to control you. And the Dutch people were mostly non-violent, but there were a few people that did try to literally assassinate and murder leading German generals and political figures. The only problem with that, and there's some fascinating stories, is whenever they attempted to do it, and if they did succeed, or even if they didn't, the Nazi soldiers would indiscriminately go through town and pull people out of families and just shoot them dead right on the spot. It was just too high of a cost to do violent resistance. You know, you have to weigh, is it important? If I took out a field marshal, is that worth 40 of my neighbors? It's just a very interesting debate, right? So we're going to talk about something in a moment that this is really the crux of why we're here, is that the Nazis wanted all the young males of Holland to transfer them to Germany to work in their factories or to work their farms, or basically all their men were fighting all over the world, and they did not have enough men to run their businesses. And I'll tell you more about that. There's a story about this one boy who was like, it was the next day he was supposed to report to be transferred to Deutschland, and he decided he was going to join one of these violent resistance groups, and he was like murdered within the week. So, so the Dutch became very effective in a type of resistance that wasn't violent, we'll just say it that way. And what was interesting is that it brought together all kinds of political parties. You know how political parties hate each other, but now everyone was on the same team, and even the Protestants and Roman Catholics. Let me tell you, there was fighting between Protestant groups in the Netherlands. My mom and my dad come from two different Dutch Reformed denominations, and it was like almost scandal that they got married. I mean, there's just enough for us to fight against something. The war united everybody against what was happening. And all kinds of resistance took place, and probably the number one operation was forgery. People forging papers, people giving Jews phony papers that made them say that they weren't Jews, people forging ration cards so they could get more, just people producing phony newspapers to confuse the people in the Socialist Party, just producing all kinds of literature that would hamper the effort. How many carpenters built hiding spaces in people's homes for Jewish people? You could walk into a house and not know that behind a particular wall was an entire area that a family could stay. People were completely working with each other to hide people. Mechanics in their efforts. One of the famous stories was that the Dutch resistance had built up to over 10 German ambulances to look exactly like a German ambulance. And because it looked exactly like a German ambulance, they put someone in there who looked sick, but underneath them was 4 guys, and they kept driving people to freedom. Driving them towards Spain, driving them towards Switzerland, and it was a forgery. It wasn't a real ambulance, but that's the way they did it. And that's sort of the way they had to put things together to try to survive. So farmers, of course, my grandfather was a farmer. They hid all kinds of people. My Opa Lammert, he not only hid his kids, but he had other young men at their farm. Early on, there was a strike, and the Nazis gave them like a one free pass on the strike, and they actually said, yeah, we're not going to work for this type of government. But the second time they struck, they striked, then the guns came out and people started losing their lives over it. So force helps people to comply. Once in a while there would be sabotage of infrastructure, but again, that just led to too many innocent people paying for it. So the phrase is that 300,000 people were hidden by 200,000 people. And whenever a pilot had to crash his plane, and he survived it, the Dutch people would get him back to where he needed to go. And they had all these systems now in place to hide people all throughout the country. Now to talk about razzias. That's when the Nazis would send hundreds of soldiers into a city block, and they would cordon off an entire city block, and every single family in that block, their house would be searched. And if anything could be found considered contraband, they were hauled off. So this was the way that they intimidated everyone. They knew they were hiding so many people. They were upset that the census revealed how many Jews really lived there and that they weren't getting them and they weren't finding them. And they knew that the Dutch people were complicit in it. And it's really interesting how the Christian church and the Catholic church still viewed the Jews as God's people. These are God's people. And they saw it as a commandment to protect them. But razzias were just wholesale descent on a particular area to find something so they could arrest people. And a little razzia takes place at my grandfather's farm. I'll tell you about that in just a second. Here's where we're going. There is this proclamation, Arbeitseinsatz, which is German for work program or something close to that. Over 500,000 Dutch people were sent to Deutschland to work in these factories, armament factories, and a farm, and the Dutch were freaking out that their children were being sent to these areas that were just being bombed over and over again. This was a real threatening thing. Happened to Poles too. It happened to Belgians. It happened to everybody who looked German. If you didn't look German, they didn't want you. They would send you to a concentration camp. But my grandfather had young boys who were becoming the age of where they were required to report. And like I said, my grandfather didn't do what they told him that they needed to do. And this is just basically artwork and pictures of the Nazis ruling over the Netherlands. Here's an announcement that all men who are born in the year 1921, you've got to report to the train stations because you're going to Deutschland. And you're going to be a worker. You're going to be a migrant worker in Nazi Germany. So that's what's happening right at the beginning of the war. that sets us up for the next movement of the story. Imagine that it's Saturday night. The sun is setting on the Jewish Sabbath, and after the sun sets, a man comes out his front door to meet with his old friend who he meets at the end of every Sabbath. And that's my grandfather, Lambert de Boer, is meeting with his good friend, Max Knorringa. Max is Jewish. My grandfather is Reformed, Protestant Reformed. And they had a great relationship. And Lambert is very, very agitated and frustrated. And he says, Max, now is the time for you and your family to leave Holland, the Netherlands. You need to go somewhere else. Every Tuesday, Max, I go to Groningen, the capital, and I meet with business leaders and I find out what's going on in the community. And I keep getting visited by a man who comes from Germany. It's just over the border. It's not far from Germany. From Nazi Germany, and he says, this man is telling me the most awful things that are happening in Germany. And worse of it, what they're doing to the Jews. I'm ashamed, I'm embarrassed about what's happening in my country. And you guys better this is before the Germans invaded. You've got to get ready for this, and you better tell your Jewish friends that there's going to be no hope for them. And so here's my grandfather telling Max Knorringa, it's time for you to go. In fact, when he told some of his older sons about what was happening, they said, we need to leave too. We should go. And in fact, after the war, my grandfather said we should have left. We shouldn't have stayed. But Max thought that he had enough friends, a good enough reputation, that people would look out for him and the atrocities would not happen in Holland, because Holland is not Germany. But at my father's insistence, he caught the last boat leaving the Netherlands before the Germans invaded. So he sailed to America on the last boat out the harbor. His family did not, his immediate family, his nuclear family went with him, but his relatives were still in the Netherlands. Well, here's that same square I showed you in a black and white picture. This is the City Hall, or the county seat of the Groningen. Doesn't that look like a stately building? I have a cousin who actually works here. We visited with her and she gave us a big tour of the building. But this is May of 2019. This is what it looked like when the Nazis invaded. So that was their building now. And they were running the show. And they were in charge, and now the Dutch were resisting. So here's a picture of my grandparents and their family. This cute little girl is 90 years old today. She's the only one who survives. There's another girl who's still yet coming, who's not in this picture. This is after 12 and a half years of marriage from Lambert and Jantje. So these are the boys that the Nazis wanted because they were getting older. Here's another announcement. Look at the years changed. Before it was if you're born in 21, now if you're born from 22 to 23, it's time for you to report. Of course, these boys are getting older. Here's a school picture from 1936. You know, give them 4 to 5 more years. These are all guys in their teens, and the Nazis are going to want. My grandfather said, no, it's not going to happen. This oldest one here, Jaap, he got an Ausweis. He was considered an essential worker because he was old enough to run farm equipment, and he was a farmer, and they needed farmers to do their work in the Netherlands. Interestingly enough, Jaap married a widow of a man who was executed by the Germans because he was a resistance fighter. And he was killed right before the Allies, and in particular this area, Canadians, liberated the Dutch. They decided to kill him and a band of other guys who were connected with him and burn papers because they didn't want to have evidence against them for what they had done to these people, so they just killed them. That was the best way to get out of getting in trouble. But so he married the widow of this one lady and helped raise a son, and then they had their own children. But these other ones, these were getting to the age where the Nazis are going to want them. So they developed a very elaborate system of putting hay bales together in a very elaborate way, where there's halls and tunnels and rooms inside the barn. And this happened at the farm called Westerstede. Here's the farm from the air. This is the black and white days. I don't know, probably the 50s after the war. So here's the house. Here's the family garden. Here's orchards, fruit trees. Here's the barn. Here's another barn. A farm with 2 barns is a big farm. Here's all the fields. They had their big passage to escape if anyone tried to come and get them. In fact, there was one early time when, because they'd filled out the census, they knew he had boys. And they would come and say, "Where's your boys? They're not here." "Well, we're going to go search around." "Go ahead and search." Well, they came to the barn and they could see the hay bale construction, and there was a little entrance there, and the boys could hear them saying, "You go first. I'm not going to go in there. I ain't going in there. You go." So they didn't go in that time. But that was a precursor for, we got to figure out some new plans about what's going on and how we're going to do things. Now, this is a real interesting thing. This is a long time ago picture. Here we are back in May 2019. This is the approach to Westerstede, right there. This is the road that goes all the way to the land. There are no trees in this country.
Yes, there are.
But that works to the advantage, because obviously a 1940s internal combustion engine could be heard from 50 miles away. You cannot come up to a farm to try to surprise anyone in an internal combustion engine. You had to come up on bicycles. And the family would work in the field and they would work on the farm together. And when they would eat their meals together, there was always a family member watching the front window to see if anyone came riding their bikes down this way. And if anyone came riding the bikes, it was like, "Hey, we got company. It's time to go into hide mode." One particular interesting incident was the time that one of the younger boys, Jaap was the oldest, but one of the younger boys was actually out working, and a couple German soldiers, actually these were Dutchmen who traded sides, were riding their bikes, and you could see that they all of a sudden got excited about seeing a kid on that, and Opa realized, "Oh, we're going to get in trouble." He ran into the house, told the younger boy to hide, told the older boy, put on clothes that looked just like his. And by the time they came all the way around, the whole thing is surrounded by a moat. There's only one way you can get on. You had to come down a long road, back around the side, and then in. By the time they came in, they said, "Hey, we saw a boy here." And they said, "Yeah, sure, I got my son working here." "Well, we want to see your son. Your son should be going to Germany." "No, he has an Ausweis." Of course, he comes down the stairs with coveralls that look just like the one who was outside, and they know something's not right. But they can't do anything about it because, hey, this was the guy you saw. There's only one son here, and he's allowed to be here. He's helping working on the farm. So they had to get more and more sophisticated about what was going on. And in particular, here's my wife early in the 90s. We visited. What happened is my grandfather had men who worked for him, and he was becoming very suspicious of one of his workers. And he just wasn't feeling right about what was going on. And his worker knew that his boys were still working on the farm and they weren't reporting. So he designed it one day that he would send this one worker who he really had bad vibes about. He sent them to the farthest field to work for a day, and he kept all of the ones he trusted. And they went and built an underground hiding place right here, right at the corner of the moat, under the orchards. They dug down, they got barn doors, they got hay bales, and they built an underground structure, and you could lay across it the sod and you wouldn't know that anything was there. They actually had a couple feeder pipes for air to come in off of the moat. And they did this all in one day, and every night they had to go inside this structure. And one night, Uncle Ed came out, and he just couldn't handle it anymore, did not like the situation, and my father, I guess, grandfather, yeah, I keep calling my father, he was a pretty even-tempered guy, but he went ballistic on him. He says, "Don't you know what you're doing? If you got caught, we all go. You cannot, you stay in there and you don't move until you hear us get you out." So, so they were staying in this underground structure for a few nights. And then we have this story that my grandfather had written anonymously and was published in the local paper anonymously about what it was like to live in Holland during this time. And a major thrust of that was, I can't believe how many people were traitors. How many people gave in and didn't resist. How frustrating that people tried to turn me and my children in. The story says, in the middle of the night, our bell was rung, and I said to my wife, now the trouble starts. So the story goes on to say that they came with their weapons, and they began to confront him with gun pointed at the chest. "Where are your boys?" "My boys aren't here." "We're going to search your farm." "Search all you want." First place they go is to the barn, and they completely demolish every hay bale that's in there. And they pull that whole thing apart. There's 11 guys. This is a little mini razzia going on. And they're pulling everything apart. My grandfather says, "I can't believe it. When I got mobilized in 1939, that guy was in my troop, and that guy was in my troop." And my grandfather tells my grandmother their names. Well, they're searching everywhere. They're searching everywhere. They cannot find anything. And he keeps telling them, "Search everywhere you want. Just, I'm telling you, the boys aren't here." Finally, the men come with a gun to my grandmother. And they point the gun at her. And they say, "We want to know where your boys are." And she says, basically, she comes at him and speaks his name. Speaks his name to him, and suddenly his whole countenance changes. He's been identified. He's a known quantity. And after that, they dropped their defenses and they said, "Fine, if we can't get your boys out of here, we're going to beat your husband back at the station to get the information we need." So, a really traumatic night. Of course, all of this happened in the room. My mom and her little sister were sleeping in the same room, and they had to pretend they were asleep the whole time when all this transpired. What they decided to do was 11 guys to tell my Opa, "You get on a bike and you're riding with us, and you're going to be riding with us into town, and we're going to take you into the station." And it was an interesting night. It was a rainy night. It was a cold night. And they started riding off. As it got closer to the town, some of the men of this group started peeling off to go do whatever else they were going to do. And by this time, there's only 2 guys with him. And I tried to find the way to describe this, but my grandfather writes in his book, he's like, "I know I can get away from these guys. I know I can do it, but I got to do this right." And what they did is they came up to a point next to a canal, and there's a rise in the road, and my grandfather starts feigning that he's like getting tired, and he lets the 2 traitors get a little bit ahead of him, and they hit the crest of the top of the hill, and then they start to coast down, and my grandfather hits the brakes, and he kind of rides down the side and starts riding off a different path on a cold, wet, rainy night. And as he's riding away, he's like, "Oh, come on, do my tires have to pop?" And then you realize, that is not a popping tire. These guys are shooting at me. And that night he rode to a friend's house. He hid in his stinging nettles at night. We got up early at 4 o'clock in the morning and said, hey, woke up his friend and said, you got to get me somewhere. I just had this whole experience happen. And word got back to the electrician who rode my uncle's bike back to the house and said, your husband's safe. And so he had to hide for the rest of the war. And the boys now had to hide somewhere different. So they were shipped into town and they all hid with church members who could be trusted. And you know, one of my uncles, Uncle Ed, said, you know, how many months was he all by himself, just locked up, all by himself?
Over a year.
Over a year, just a young man who couldn't see the light of day and was always hiding. My mom's, Kara Joy wrote about it, I think we published that in an Informer. My mom's duty was to ride into town with a milk can, and then she would bring it to the shoemaker, and then the shoemaker would get the milk to the boys, and they would use the network to supply them with additional food and things. So anyway, they all had to hide throughout the war. So my grandmother had to run the household by itself. The war got so bad. I mean, as bad as this sounds, in the south of Holland, it was twice as bad. People were starving to death. And they shuttled families up to the north where there were farms so many people would stop dying from malnutrition. And it was really interesting how my mom realized that the Roman Catholics are a lot different than Protestants. A whole giant Roman Catholic family came to stay with them with their little statues and their little practices and prayer and beads. And anyway, they stayed with them throughout the end of the war just because people were dying all throughout Holland, and she had to run the house all by herself. At one point, my grandfather did come back because someone was trying to trick him, and he was told through certain channels it's safe to go back now. But he showed up and she says, no way, you are not allowed to be here. You get out of here. I won't be able to sleep at all if you're here and we go through this again. So he went back into hiding again until the end of the war. Of course, Liberation Day, I didn't realize that's at Burgerzeist. That's a good name for a restaurant, right? But Liberation Day was really fantastic. There was this really interesting thing that took place where the Allies came up to Antwerp, Belgium, and their next step was just to plow through Holland, and then there was a big stall for a number of weeks. What happened then was this thing called Mad Tuesday, and all the traitors, all the German sympathizers, Nazi sympathizers, they collected all their papers and burned them, and they all fled to Germany. They just all left. And so much of the incriminating evidence of what they had done was actually destroyed because the troops didn't keep moving. It stopped for a while. And then, you know, they realized that the goose was up, and so many people went to Nazi Germany, where who knows what happened to them. I remember famous pictures my mom showed me about how they shamed Dutch collaborators, especially the women. They would shave their heads and march them around in public and mock them and shame them. It's a difficult time, difficult circumstances. Of course, the Canadians were the ones who freed this part of Holland, and in commemoration of that, there's a specially manufactured tulip that's named after Canada that you can buy today. It's its own gene species, class, phylum, order, whatever. So that was a tribute to them. So now we get to the end of the story. What happened to Max Knorringa? And my sister's going to help me with this now, because you know, most people you can find on Google or you can find on some of these research groups. I can't find hardly anything on Max, except I found his wife's obituary notice. See, there's Max right there. And someone lived in Downey, someone lived in El Toro, California. That was in Orange County, where we're from. And here's his children. One day in America, a letter comes from the Dutch government, and it reads, "Dear Max, here is a check for your family's wealth that got left behind in the Netherlands. All of your living relatives were executed during the war. Their funds were absconded by the Nazis, but we've researched it and we've got it all back, and this all belongs to you." So there's that moment where you think, why am I benefiting from the death of my family? So that put Max in a pretty interesting position. And so what he decided to do was to pay it forward, and he was going to help a lot of Dutchmen immigrate to the United States. He would be their sponsor. So one of Max's first sponsors was Uncle Ed, my uncle. Before you come to this country, you needed a viable sponsor who could pay and cover your expenses if you fell on hard times. Max had a considerable amount of money now. And he sponsored Uncle Ed, and he began farming in California. And not soon after that, when he was set up, Uncle Ed sponsored my family. So the man who was told to flee the Netherlands became the man who brought my family to the United States. And there's another kind of interesting twist to the story, how that kind of comes around and works to our benefit. So this dashing young man and woman were married in the Netherlands. They had 2 boys. One of them's right here. He was born in a house. He was born old school. And they came to the United States. They took the Grote Bear boat and landed in New York Harbor and took the train to California. And he started a life as an insurance salesman. First he did some other jobs first, but that's what was his main job. Then he ended up having a happy family. So here's a Jewish man who actually advanced the gospel, because he's sort of a mediocre pastor, and had a beautiful daughter who has a great family in Denver, and a school teacher with a wonderful family, and a California senator who is enthralled with Jewish history in California. He's got a library worth of books of Jewish history. So my dad was here for his 90th birthday. I'm glad my mom's here for her 90th birthday. Kind of brings us to some concluding remarks. And I hope you can put together some of the puzzle pieces for yourself about, there's a lot of things that are going on right now that sound really similar to what we just learned. And I just want to say as a lesson, we're always at war. Here are the 4 understood levels of war. Tactical is when you're really dropping the bombs. Operational is when you're setting up for it. Strategic is when you're considering all the things that you have to defend. Political is what's going on a lot in this country right now. I think of the country of Israel. Do you think they ever think that they're not at war? They are. They've got networks and systems, and they are thinking about every potentiality that could end their civilization. And that's the way we need to think too. Well, we're the biggest country in the world. We're the strongest. It looks like we can be taken down by just some really angry mobs. It's really kind of a frightening prospect. History is our textbook. There's a lot of lessons that when I rehearse this story, I think, man, we are replaying a lot of things right now. We have to be wise to it. Another thing is that there's blessings from tragedy. This is the hardest part about it for me. Just think, my neighbor's house got bombed, but you know what? All the wood in that house fed 50 families because they could burn all his wood. Isn't that a terrible thing to think? But it was an actuality. And I make the obvious connection that Max being forced out of his country became a blessing to my family, became a blessing to my life. It makes you feel undeserving that certain people went through toil my parents, my mom went through so much toil, and it only ends up as blessings, and am I able to identify it as that? Do I recognize the blessings in someone else's sacrifice? And that's just gospel language too. So one thing that I would really recommend, and I try to listen to him as much as possible, is Frank Gaffney. There's a podcast, Secure Freedom Radio, every day. And he interviews people. And the only problem with listening to a show is I get scared about what's going to happen. But at least I know some ideas about what's going on and where our priorities should lie as a nation. So this is sort of the story of my mom's life, my life by connection, and I pray it becomes a lesson to all of us. And I guess I'll conclude with that. Is that all right? All right.